You need to be more financially responsible, Emily. My mother's voice dripped with condescension as she stood in my parents' kitchen, her manicured nails drumming against the marble countertop that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. I had called to ask if I could borrow $500 to fix my car's transmission, the same car that had been limping along for 3 years, held together by duct tape and prayer and the kindness of a mechanic who let me pay in installments. "We can't keep bailing you out every time you mismanage your money," my father added from somewhere behind her, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I'd been hearing my entire 25 years. I wanted to scream that this wasn't mismanagement, that I was working 60 hours a week between my junior graphic designer position and my weekend barista shifts, that I was drowning in $87,000 of student loan debt while eating ramen 4 nights a week and wearing the same 3 outfits on rotation because I couldn't afford anything else. I wanted to point out that they'd just returned from 3 weeks in Italy, that their driveway currently held a Mercedes, a BMW, and a Range Rover, that their house was worth at least $2 million, while I lived in a 400-square-foot apartment with mold creeping up the bathroom walls that my landlord refused to fix. But I didn't say any of that because I'd learned long ago that it wouldn't matter, that somehow the conversation would twist back to my failings, my inability to budget properly, my lack of discipline and foresight. "I understand," I said instead, my voice small and defeated in a way that made me hate myself a little more. "I'll figure something out." My mother's sigh was heavy with performative patience. "We're not trying to be harsh, sweetheart. We just want you to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Your brother never asks us for money." "Of course he doesn't," I thought bitterly, "because you bought him a BMW when he turned 23. Because he works at Dad's company, making 6 figures. Because you just gave him $50,000 for a down payment on a house." But I swallowed those words too. "I know, Mom." There was a pause, and then she said, "Don't forget about dinner this Saturday. Your birthday. Your grandfather is insisting on being there." Something in her tone shifted when she mentioned Grandpa, a tightness that I'd noticed before but never quite understood. "I'll be there," I promised, and as I hung up the phone and stared at my car repair estimate and my bank account balance that had exactly $243 in it, I felt that familiar crushing weight of inadequacy settle over my shoulders. I had 3 days until my 25th birthday dinner at my parents' mansion. 3 days until I'd sit at their table and feel small and grateful for whatever token gift they decided I deserved. My grandfather would be there, though, the one person in my family who'd ever looked at me like I mattered, and somehow that single thought made the whole ordeal feel bearable. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been there my entire life, though I hadn't recognized it as cruelty until much later. Until therapy would eventually help me name what had been done to me as something other than character building. When I was 16 and all my friends got cars for their birthdays, I took the bus, watching from the window as my mother drove past me in her Mercedes on my route home from school, and when I asked if maybe I could get something used, something cheap, just for transportation, my father said no, that I needed to learn responsibility, that I needed to earn it myself. I worked that summer at a grocery store, saved $2,000, but by then I'd realized that even if I bought a car, I couldn't afford the insurance or gas or maintenance. So the money went to college savings instead, while my parents took a vacation to France and my brother, 3 years older, drove the Audi they'd leased for him. College was when the disparity became impossible to ignore, though I still found ways to excuse it, to make it make sense in my head. My brother went to a private university, $40,000 a year, and our parents paid every cent. But when it was my turn, they sat me down and explained that they'd already done that for one child, and now it was time for me to contribute to my own education, to have skin in the game, to understand the value of investment. I took out loans, $87,000 worth by the time I graduated, while they renovated their kitchen for $90,000 and installed a pool for $65,000 more. There was the prom dress I bought myself at TJ Maxx for $30 while my mother wore Chanel, the graduation ceremony they barely attended because they had a golf tournament, arriving late and leaving early while my brother's graduation 2 years earlier had included a party with 100 guests and a catered dinner that cost more than my entire final semester. I remembered sitting in my dorm room crying over textbooks I couldn't afford, calling home to ask if they could help with just one book, just the biology textbook that was $350, and my mother saying that I should have planned better, should have budgeted for it, while in the background I could hear my father talking about the new boat they were considering. My grandfather was there sometimes, at holidays and birthdays, always kind to me in a quiet way that felt like a secret between us. And I noticed how he'd watch my parents with this look I couldn't quite read, something between disappointment and anger. But he never contradicted them, never undermined their authority, and I assumed he agreed with their methods even if he felt sorry for me. I learned to expect nothing, to ask for nothing, to make myself small and grateful for whatever scraps of attention or affection came my way. And when my brother got a Rolex for his 25th birthday last year, I told myself the Target gift card I'd probably get would be fine, that I didn't need expensive things, that wanting them made me shallow and materialistic like my parents always implied I was. My present life was a study in survival economics, every dollar accounted for and stretched until it screamed, and I'd become an expert at making nothing last as long as possible. I worked 50 to 60 hours most weeks, my junior graphic designer position at a small marketing firm paying $38,000 a year, barely enough to cover rent and minimum loan payments, which meant my weekend barista shifts at the coffee shop near campus were non-negotiable, adding another $12,000 annually that went straight to interest on my $87,000 in student loan debt that seemed to grow rather than shrink no matter how much I paid. My apartment was 400 square feet of desperation in a building that had seen better decades, mold creeping up the bathroom walls in green-black fingers that I scrubbed with bleach every week, even though it always came back. And when I'd asked my landlord to fix it, he'd shrugged and said if I didn't like it, I could move, knowing I couldn't afford to, knowing I was trapped by my credit score and my bank account. I ate ramen 4 nights a week, pasta with butter on the fifth night, and if I was lucky, I could afford chicken breasts on sale for the weekend. And I hadn't bought new clothes in 2 years, except for underwear and one pair of work pants when my old ones literally split at the seam. My car was dying slowly, the transmission grinding in a way that made my stomach clench every time I shifted gears, and the $500 repair estimate might as well have been $5,000 for how impossible it was, which was why I'd called my parents in desperation, only to be lectured about financial responsibility by people who'd just spent 3 weeks in Italy and whose driveway held vehicles worth more than I'd earn in 2 years. My brother was 27 now, working at our father's commercial real estate company, with a title that sounded important, and a salary I knew was 6 figures, because he'd mentioned it once, casually, the way people who've never worried about money do, and he drove a BMW they'd bought him for his 25th birthday, the same birthday where he'd also received that Rolex, and just last month they'd given him $50,000 for a down payment on a house, in a neighborhood I couldn't even afford to drive through. I'd stopped asking them for help after the car incident, the shame of their refusal and their lectures burning worse than the actual poverty, my pride battered but still intact enough that I couldn't bear another rejection, another lesson about budgeting from people who thought budgeting meant deciding between the Mercedes and the Range Rover for their weekend trip. Then 3 days before my birthday, my grandfather called, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, insistent in a way that was almost urgent when he said I had to come to dinner on Saturday, that it was important, that there were things we needed to discuss, and something in his tone made my skin prickle with an anxiety I couldn't name, a sense that whatever was coming would change everything. Though I couldn't imagine how or why or what an old man's birthday dinner could possibly do to transform the grinding poverty that had become my entire existence. I arrived at my parents' house on Saturday evening, just as the sun was setting, the golden light making their mansion look even more imposing. All brick and columns and perfectly manicured lawn that a service maintained twice weekly for God knows how much money. The circular driveway holding my father's Range Rover and my mother's Mercedes, vehicles worth more combined than I'd earned in the last 3 years of my life. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her smile tight and practiced, as she air-kissed near my cheek without actually making contact, her Dior perfume overwhelming in the way expensive things often are. And her eyes traveled down my dress with that particular expression I'd learned to recognize as disapproval masked as concern when she said, "Oh, is that new?" Knowing perfectly well it wasn't, knowing it was the same navy dress I'd worn to every family event for the past 2 years, because it was the only thing I owned that was appropriate. And when I said no, she nodded and murmured something about thrift stores being so trendy now, as if I shopped at them for fashion rather than survival. The dining room was already set with a china that cost more per plate than my monthly grocery budget, and my brother Marcus was there with his fiancée Jessica. Her hand extended the moment she saw me to show off the engagement ring that caught the chandelier light like a tiny disco ball. 3 carats that I later learned cost $15,000, half of which my parents had paid for because that's what parents do, apparently, when they actually love their children. My father was at the head of the table scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up when I entered, his greeting a distracted Emily, accompanied by a nod that could have been meant for anyone, and I took my usual seat, the one closest to the kitchen, the one that had always felt like it was separated from the real family. And I tried to ignore the way my chest felt tight, and my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the water glass. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, and the shift in the room was immediate, everyone straightening slightly, my father actually putting his phone down. Because at 79 years old with a retail empire that spanned 3 states and a reputation for being sharp as a blade, even in his 8th decade, my grandfather commanded respect, in a way that wasn't requested, but simply existed. He moved slowly but deliberately, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit expensive but understated. And when he reached me, he pulled me up from my chair and hugged me tightly, longer than usual. And I felt him whisper against my ear, his voice low and firm and carrying a promise I didn't yet understand. "Today you learn the truth." And something in those words made my skin prickle with an emotion between hope and fear. Dinner was tense in ways I couldn't quite name, conversations starting and stopping awkwardly, my mother's laugh too bright, my father refilling his wineglass 3 times before we'd even finished the main course. And when dessert came, my mother produced a birthday card with theatrical ceremony, and inside was a gift card to Target for $50, the same store where I bought my toilet paper and dish soap, and she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "We know you're on a budget, sweetheart, so we thought something practical would be better than something frivolous." And I thought about the Rolex my brother had received last year for his 25th birthday, thought about it sitting in its case in his closet, and I managed to say thank you, even though the words tasted like ash. And the whole time my grandfather sat watching with his lips pressed into a thin line that could have been anger or disgust or both. His cake untouched on the plate in front of him. My grandfather set his fork down carefully beside his untouched cake, the slight clink of silver against china somehow louder than it should have been, and then he stood with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd made a decision and would not be swayed from it, his hands flat on the table as he looked around at each of us in turn, before saying in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I have something we need to discuss as a family." My father's face changed immediately, color draining then flooding back as he leaned forward and said, "Dad, not now. This isn't the time." But my grandfather ignored him completely, reaching into the leather messenger bag he'd set beside his chair and pulling out a manila folder that looked worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times. And I felt my heart start to beat faster, though I couldn't have said why, except that the air in the room had suddenly become heavy with something I couldn't name. My grandfather opened the folder with steady hands and pulled out a stack of documents, legal papers with official seals and dense text, and he looked directly at me when he said, "Emily, when you were born, your grandmother and I established a trust fund for you in the amount of $3 million, accessible to you on your 25th birthday, which is today." And the words didn't make sense at first, just sounds that my brain couldn't organize into meaning. And I heard my mother make a small gasping sound while my father said, "Jesus Christ," under his breath, and my grandfather continued without pause. "Your parents were named as trustees, responsible for managing the fund until you came of age, and they were instructed to inform you of its existence by your 18th birthday, or at the very latest by 21. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like pressure against your eardrums. And I looked at my parents and saw my mother had gone pale as paper, while my father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping, and my own voice sounded strange and distant when I said, "What?" Because surely I'd misheard, surely this wasn't real. But my grandfather was sliding the documents across the table toward me, and I could see bank statements with my name on them, legal papers with seals and signatures, and the numbers were right there in black and white. $3 million, my name, my birth date. My father started to speak, leaning forward with his hands raised in that placating gesture I'd seen him use in business negotiations, saying, "We were going to tell her. We just wanted to wait until—" But my grandfather cut him off with a look of such cold fury that my father actually flinched, and my grandfather said in a voice like steel, "You've been trustees for 25 years. You've watched your daughter work herself to exhaustion, live in poverty, beg you for $500 to fix her car, and you said nothing. You let her believe she was alone and unsupported while you sat on $3 million that was always hers." I looked at Marcus and saw that he was staring at our parents with his mouth slightly open, shocked, and I realized he hadn't known either. None of us had known except them. And my grandfather pushed the documents the rest of the way across the table until they sat in front of my plate next to the $50 Target gift card, and he said to me, "It's all real, Emily. Every page documented and legal, and as of today, it's entirely yours." I picked up the documents with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, my fingers leaving slight moisture marks on the papers as I tried to make sense of the words swimming in front of my eyes, and when I finally looked up at my parents, I heard my own voice come out broken and raw when I said, "You knew? This whole time, you knew?" My mother's face crumpled in that practiced way she had, tears forming instantly as she reached across the table toward me, though she didn't actually try to touch me. And she said in a voice thick with emotion that might have been genuine or might have been performance. I couldn't tell anymore. "Sweetheart, we didn't want you to become spoiled, entitled like so many trust fund children. We wanted you to build character, to understand the value of—" But I cut her off because something was breaking open inside my chest. 25 years of believing I wasn't enough, believing I was the problem, and I said, "Character? You wanted me to build character?" My father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, his face settling into that expression of stern authority that had always made me feel small. And he said in his boardroom voice, "You needed to learn the value of hard work. Emily, real work. Not have everything handed to you, and look at you now. You're independent, self-sufficient. You should be thanking us for—" And that's when something inside me snapped completely, and I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like a scream. "I worked 60-hour weeks," I said, and my voice was shaking but getting stronger with each word. "I lived on ramen and pasta for months at a time. I had panic attacks about my debt at 3 in the morning. I cried myself to sleep wondering what was wrong with me, that my own parents wouldn't help me even when I was desperate, and you watched. You watched me suffer when you knew the whole time that there was $3 million with my name on it." I looked at my brother and saw him staring at our parents with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and recognition. And my grandfather cleared his throat and said in a voice that cut through the room, There's more, Emily. Something else you need to know. And my mother made a sound like a wounded animal and said, "Don't." But my grandfather ignored her completely and said, "Marcus had a matching trust fund, 3 million as well, and your parents paid for his college, his car, his down payment, all of it, by taking loans against his trust with the full intention of repaying it, but they used their position as trustees to justify it, claimed it was proper financial management, and they never offered you the same option, never even told you it existed as a possibility." The room tilted sideways, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay standing as I realized the full scope of what they'd done. Every denied request for help while Marcus got everything, every lecture about responsibility while they funded his entire life, every moment I'd believed I was somehow less worthy, less deserving, and it had all been a lie, a choice they'd made, not about building my character, but about something else entirely, something that felt like cruelty dressed up as parenting. I forced myself to sit back down because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, and I pulled the documents closer with hands that felt disconnected from my body, shuffling through pages of bank statements and legal papers that all said the same impossible thing in slightly different ways. And there it was in black and white, on the most recent statement dated just 3 days ago. Account balance $3,247,612.33. My name listed as sole beneficiary. My parents listed as trustees until today, my 25th birthday, when full control transferred to me. I looked up at my grandfather and heard myself ask in a voice that didn't sound like mine, "It's real? All of this is real?" And he nodded once, firm and certain, and said, "Every penny, Emily, invested conservatively and grown over 25 years, and it's been yours all along." I kept reading, trying to make my brain work properly. And that's when I saw the line items that made my stomach drop. Trustee fees paid annually, $50,000 every single year for 25 years. And I did the math automatically, even though I didn't want to. $1,250,000 my parents had been paid to manage money they never told me existed, and I looked at my mother and said, "You took fees? You made over $1 million in fees for hiding my own money from me?" My mother's tears were flowing freely now, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark lines, and she said, "Those fees are standard. They're legal. We were providing a service, managing the investments, and we did it well. Look at how much it's grown." But my grandfather's voice cut through hers like a knife when he said, "You were being paid $50,000 a year to keep your daughter in poverty and ignorance. Don't dress it up as financial management." My father's face had gone red now, that dangerous color that used to make me back down from any argument. And he said, "We had every legal right to those fees. We spent hundreds of hours managing that portfolio, and Emily, you have no idea how much work goes into." But I couldn't listen to any more justifications, any more explanations that were really just excuses, and I said, "When did you know? When did you know you weren't going to tell me?" My grandfather cleared his throat and said, "I didn't know they'd kept it secret until last month, Emily. I called your mother to confirm the details for the trust transfer on your 25th birthday, to make sure everything was in order, and she said something that struck me as odd. She said, 'She doesn't know yet.' And when I asked what she meant, she tried to backtrack, but I pressed, and she finally admitted you'd never been told, 25 years old, and didn't know yet, as if there was still time, as if this was acceptable." My mother reached toward me again, her hand trembling, and she said in a voice thick with tears, "We were protecting you, sweetheart. We were going to tell you. We just wanted to wait until you were mature enough, until you'd really learned." And something in me broke completely, and I stood up again, steadier this time, and said, "Protecting me? I couldn't afford therapy when I was so depressed I could barely function. I worked through pneumonia because I couldn't miss shifts and lose the income. I asked you for $500 2 months ago, and you said no. You lectured me about budgeting while sitting on $3 million that was mine. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourselves, protecting your control. protecting your right to watch me struggle while you decided if and when I deserved to know the truth. I looked at Marcus and saw that he'd gone very pale, staring down at his plate like he might be sick. And I realized he was finally understanding what his entire life had been built on, every advantage he'd been given while I was denied everything, not because there wasn't enough to go around, but because our parents had decided he deserved it, and I didn't. And the weight of that knowledge was written all over his face. My father's voice cut through the room with that tone he used in business meetings, authoritative and final, dismissing everything I'd said, as if my pain was just another negotiation tactic. And he said, "You're being dramatic, Emily. Everything we did was for your own good. And someday when you have children of your own, you'll understand the difficult choices parents have to make." But something had shifted inside me during the past 10 minutes. Something fundamental had broken and reformed into a shape that was harder and clearer. And I looked at him directly in a way I'm not sure I ever had before, and said, "No, it was cruel. You had the power to help me, and you chose not to. Not because you couldn't, not because the money didn't exist, but because you wanted to teach me some lesson while you lived in luxury, while you vacationed in Italy and drove cars that cost more than my annual salary, and watched me cry about debt I never needed to have." My grandfather reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, cream-colored and expensive-looking, and he slid it across the table to me as he said, "Emily, this is my attorney, Gerald Morrison. I've already contacted him and explained the situation. The trust transfers to your sole control tomorrow morning. Your parents are removed as trustees effective immediately, and I've also had him review the trustee fee structure over the past 25 years, because given their failure to disclose the trust's existence to you, you may be entitled to recover some or all of those fees." My mother made a sound like she'd been slapped, and her hand flew to her throat as she said, "You're turning her against us. This is what you've always wanted, to undermine our parenting, to make us look like the villains." And my grandfather's face went cold in a way that made him look like a stranger, like the ruthless businessman he must have been to build his retail empire. And he said in a voice that could have frozen water, "You did that yourselves. I'm just making sure Emily knows the truth you spent 25 years hiding." I gathered the documents with hands that had stopped shaking, stacking them carefully and sliding them back into the folder, and I picked up my purse from where I'd set it on the floor when I arrived hours ago, when I'd still believed this was just a birthday dinner, when I'd still been the Emily who thought she wasn't good enough. And Marcus spoke for the first time since my grandfather had revealed his trust fund had paid for his life. His voice small and broken when he said, "Em, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. They never told me where the money came from. I just thought they had it. I'm so sorry." And I looked at my brother and saw that he was telling the truth, saw the horror in his eyes as he understood what our parents had done. And I nodded once and said, "I know, Marcus, I believe you, but I can't be here right now. I can't look at them anymore." And I walked toward the door of the dining room, my legs steadier now, carrying me away from the table where I'd finally learned the truth. And behind me, I heard my mother start to cry in earnest, and my father say something angry that I didn't bother to listen to, because their words didn't matter anymore. Their explanations and justifications couldn't change what they'd done or who they'd chosen to be. And I walked out of that mansion into the cool night air and got into my car with the check engine light that was always on, and drove away from my childhood home for what I somehow knew wouldn't be the last time, but would be the last time I went there as the person I'd been before tonight. I slept maybe 2 hours that night, lying awake in my apartment with the folder of documents on my nightstand, where I could reach over and touch them every time I started to wonder if the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. And when morning finally came, I was showered and dressed by 7, even though my appointment with Gerald Morrison wasn't until 10. So I sat at my tiny kitchen table drinking coffee and reading through every page again, memorizing numbers and dates and legal language that all confirmed the same impossible truth. The law office was in downtown Chicago, in one of those buildings with marble floors and the kind of quiet that money buys. And my grandfather was already there in the reception area when I arrived 15 minutes early, and he stood and hugged me and said, "How are you holding up?" And I said honestly, "I don't know. I feel like I'm going to wake up." And he squeezed my shoulder and said, "It's real, Emily. All of it." Gerald Morrison turned out to be maybe 60, with kind eyes and an air of competence that made me feel steadier the moment we sat down in his office, and he walked me through everything with a patience that suggested my grandfather had warned him I was in shock, explaining that the trust had been structured to transfer full control to me at 25, regardless of what the trustees wanted, that my parents' role had been to manage the investments until that date, and then step aside, and that as of 9 o'clock this morning when the bank opened, I had complete and sole authority over every penny. He showed me where to sign, explained how I could access the funds, set up a meeting with the bank's wealth management team for later that week, and then he said something that made my stomach clench when he added, "Your grandfather asked me to review the trustee fees your parents collected over the years. And while those fees are technically legal and were within the range specified in the trust documents, given their failure to disclose the trust's existence to you, despite clear language in the original document stating you should be informed by age 21 at the latest, you would have grounds to contest those fees and potentially recover some or all of that money." I looked at my grandfather and then back at Gerald Morrison and said, "How much are we talking about?" And he said, $1,250,000 over 25 years. And the number hit me again, even though I'd calculated it myself last night. But then I thought about what contesting it would mean: lawyers and fights, and more contact with my parents, more time spent looking backward instead of forward. And I said, "I don't want it. I want a clean break. I just want to be done." And my grandfather started to protest, saying, "Emily, that's a significant amount of money. You shouldn't let them keep it after what they did." But I shook my head and said, "I have $3 million, Grandpa, more than I ever dreamed of having, and fighting them for more would cost me something I can't afford to lose. It would cost me peace." And I saw him understand, saw him nod slowly and say, "All right, if that's what you want." We finished the paperwork, and Gerald Morrison shook my hand and said, "Your grandfather speaks very highly of you, and for what it's worth, I think you're making a mature decision about the fees. Sometimes the cost of fighting isn't measured in dollars." And then my grandfather and I left that office and walked out into a morning that felt different somehow, sharper and more real. And he said, "Let me take you to lunch. We should talk." And I realized I wanted that, wanted to understand more about why he'd set up the trust in the first place, and why my father had turned into the kind of man who could watch his daughter struggle while sitting on her inheritance. Over lunch at a quiet restaurant where the servers knew my grandfather by name, he told me things I'd never known: how my grandmother had been the one who insisted on the trust, how she'd grown up poor and understood what financial security meant, how she'd loved me fiercely during the 2 years she'd known me before a stroke took her suddenly and completely. He said, "Your father, my son, he's always been focused on control, Emily. Even as a boy, he needed to feel like he was the one making decisions, the one with power, and I thought the legal structure of the trust would protect you from that. I thought having it in writing that you should be informed would be enough, but I was wrong not to follow up, not to check, and I'm sorrier than I can say that my failure to verify allowed them to do this to you." I reached across the table and took his hand and said, "You didn't fail me, Grandpa. You gave me this gift, you and Grandma, and you're the one who made sure I finally knew the truth. You saved me." And I saw his eyes get bright with tears he didn't let fall, and he said, "Your grandmother would have loved the woman you've become. She would be so proud." And then he said something that shifted everything when he added, "Don't make any big decisions immediately, Emily. Sit with this, feel what you need to feel. The money will still be there next week and next month. There's no rush." And I realized this was what actual parental love looked like: this concern for my emotional well-being over everything else, this trust in my ability to figure things out, and I understood with sudden clarity that I'd found the parent figure I'd needed all along, 25 years late, but here now when I needed him most. A week passed, and I didn't contact my parents, didn't respond to the voicemails that kept piling up on my phone, or the text messages that started apologetic and gradually turned demanding, and when I checked on Saturday morning, I counted 47 missed calls between the two of them. My mother's messages, all variations of, "We need to talk about this," and my father's increasingly terse, "Call me back immediately," but I deleted them all, and felt something like relief when I did. Marcus had texted me the day after the dinner, a long message that I could tell he'd written and rewritten, saying he was sorry, and he'd had no idea where his money came from, and he was trying to process what our parents had done, and he understood if I hated him, but he hoped someday I could forgive him. And I'd responded briefly, told him I didn't hate him, and I knew he hadn't known, but I needed space to figure out what all of this meant, and he'd written back just, "I understand. I love you." And I'd cried reading those 3 words because they felt real, in a way my parents' love never had. I kept working both jobs that week, even though I had $3 million sitting in an account I could access with a phone call. Kept making coffee at the cafe on Saturday and Sunday morning, and showing up to my desk at the design studio Monday through Friday. Because I didn't know who I was without those jobs yet, and I was afraid to find out too quickly. Afraid that if I changed everything at once, I'd lose track of myself entirely. On Thursday afternoon, I met with Catherine Chen, the financial advisor my grandfather had recommended. A woman in her 40s with an air of calm competence, who didn't blink when I told her I'd just found out about a $3 million trust fund and had no idea what to do with it. And over 2 hours, she helped me create a plan that felt manageable and real. Pay off the student loans first, all $87,000 of them, gone in one transaction that would free me from the weight I'd been carrying since graduation. Buy a modest condo, nothing extravagant, maybe $250,000, something with good light and no mold, and a landlord who was actually me. Invest the bulk of it, about 2.5 million, in a diversified portfolio that would grow and generate income so I wouldn't have to touch the principal unless I wanted to. Catherine said, "You could stop working entirely and live very comfortably on the investment income." But I shook my head and said, "I still want to work. I just want it to be on my terms, doing things I actually care about." And she smiled and said, "That's wise. Purpose matters as much as security." I quit the barista job that Saturday, gave my 2 weeks' notice even though I could have walked out, because I'd never been the kind of person who burned bridges, even when the bridge was just a coffee shop that paid me $12 an hour. And my manager said, "I'm happy for you, Emily. You always seemed like you were meant for more than this," which made me wonder what people had seen in me that I'd never been able to see in myself. I kept the design job because I actually liked the work and the people and the feeling of creating something visual and meaningful, but I talked to my boss about going part-time, and she agreed immediately because I was good at what I did, and part-time was better than losing me entirely. On Tuesday evening, I had my first appointment with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a therapist my grandfather's attorney had recommended, who specialized in family trauma, and whose office was in a renovated brownstone with plants in every window. And when I sat down on her couch and she asked me why I was there, I started talking and didn't stop for 45 minutes, the whole story spilling out. And when I finally finished, she said gently, "Emily, what you're describing is 25 years of emotional abuse, masked as parenting. And I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I want you to know that your feelings of betrayal and anger are completely valid." And hearing someone with credentials and expertise name what my parents had done as abuse made something crack open inside my chest, made me cry in a way I hadn't let myself cry yet. And she handed me tissues and sat with me in that grief and said, "We're going to work through this together. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." They showed up on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after that first therapy session, and I heard the knock on my apartment door while I was heating up leftover pasta and almost didn't answer because I wasn't expecting anyone. But then my mother's voice came through the door saying, "Emily, we know you're in there. Please, we just want to talk." And I stood frozen in my tiny kitchen, feeling my heart rate spike the way Dr. Mitchell and I had been working on recognizing, and I took 3 deep breaths before I walked to the door and opened it to find both my parents standing there, my mother holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, and my father looking uncomfortable in casual clothes like he'd dressed down deliberately to seem less threatening. My mother tried to hand me the flowers and said, "Sweetheart, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. We've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks." And my father added before I could respond, "You're being influenced by your grandfather's bitterness, Emily. He's always resented that we made our own success instead of relying on his money." And something that had been building in me since that birthday dinner suddenly crystallized into clarity. And I said, "No, I'm seeing clearly for the first time in my life. And if you want to come in and talk, you need to understand that I'm not the same person I was 2 weeks ago." They came in, and my mother's eyes swept over my apartment with that familiar expression of barely concealed distaste, and we sat down, them on my sagging couch, and me in the chair I'd pulled from the kitchen table. And my father started with, "We understand you're upset, but you need to understand our perspective. Everything we did was carefully considered." And I cut him off and said, "You watched me ask you for $500 for a car repair while you were planning a trip to Italy. Do you remember that? You lectured me about budgeting while you knew I had $3 million that you were hiding from me." My mother's turn, her voice taking on that pleading tone I'd heard 1,000 times when she wanted something. "We didn't want you to become spoiled, entitled like so many young people with money. We wanted you to build character." And I laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I asked you to help me pay for therapy when I was depressed in college, and you said I needed to learn to handle my own problems. I worked through pneumonia because I couldn't afford to miss shifts. I had panic attacks about debt while you collected $50,000 a year in fees for managing money that was always mine, and you call that character building?" My father's face hardened the way it always did when someone challenged him, and he said, "We gave you something more valuable than money. We gave you work ethic, discipline, the ability to stand on your own 2 feet." And I felt something break free inside me when I said, "You gave me trauma and trust issues, and if work ethic was what you cared about, then why does Marcus have any? You handed him everything: college paid for, car bought outright, down payment on a house, job handed to him at your company. So don't pretend this was about teaching me values." My mother's careful mask slipped for just a moment, and she said quietly, almost to herself, "We thought you'd waste it. You were always so dreamy, so impractical. We didn't think you'd be responsible with that kind of money." And there it was, the truth finally spoken out loud. They hadn't trusted me, had never trusted me, had looked at their daughter and decided she was less capable, less worthy, less deserving than their son. And I said, "You didn't think I could handle it, so you just decided for me, decided I didn't even deserve to know it existed." My mother tried to say something, but I held up my hand and said, "Here's what happens now. I'm taking space from both of you. Minimum 6 months of no contact. And if you want any kind of relationship with me, eventually, it's going to require family therapy with a qualified therapist and genuine accountability for what you did. Not explanations or justifications or more reasons why you thought you were right, but actual accountability, acknowledgement that you hurt me and that it was wrong." And my father stood up, his face reddening the way it always did when someone challenged his authority, and he said, "You can't cut us off. We're your parents. You don't get to dictate terms to us." And I stood up too, feeling steadier than I'd felt in weeks, and said, "I absolutely can. I'm an adult, and you spent 25 years teaching me that I don't need anyone's help, that I have to make it on my own. And turns out you were right. I don't need you." My mother's voice took on that trembling quality she used when she wanted sympathy, and she said, "Emily, please, we're your parents. We love you. You can't just throw away our whole relationship over money." And something snapped inside me when she said that, and I said, "This isn't about money. This is about 25 years of you watching me struggle and choosing not to help, choosing to let me believe I wasn't worth helping, and if you think that's love, then I don't want your version of it." I walked to my apartment door and opened it, the signal clear that this conversation was over, and my father tried one more time as he walked past me, couldn't resist throwing one final barb the way he always did when he was losing control of a situation, and he said, "That money will be gone in a year. You've never been good with planning or discipline. You'll waste it all and come crawling back to us." And I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for maybe the first time, saw the need for control and the fear of losing it. And I said calmly, quietly, "I've lived on $30,000 a year while working 60-hour weeks. I think I can manage 3 million just fine. And if I do need help someday, if something happens and I need support, I have Grandpa, I have friends, I have people in my life who actually care about my well-being, and not just about maintaining control over me." My mother tried to reach for my hand as she passed, and I stepped back, and she flinched like I'd slapped her. And my father said, "You'll regret this. You'll see what the real world is like without us, and you'll regret it." And I said, "I've been living in the real world my entire adult life. You made sure of that. The only difference now is I'm doing it without your voices in my head telling me I'm not good enough." And I closed the door behind them, locked it, and stood there shaking for 5 full minutes before I called Dr. Mitchell and left a message asking if she had any emergency appointments available because I needed to process what had just happened, needed someone to tell me that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, even though my parents' faces when I'd done it made me feel like maybe I was the terrible person in this story. Dr. Mitchell called me back within an hour and fit me in the next morning, and that emergency session turned into a twice-weekly standing appointment for the next month because there was so much to unpack, so much I'd been holding in for 25 years that was finally spilling out now that the dam had broken. And 3 months after that confrontation with my parents, I was standing in my new condo, a beautiful one-bedroom on the fourth floor of a converted warehouse building with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in so much light. I sometimes just stood there in the morning, watching the sun move across my hardwood floors, and I'd cried when I made the final payment on my student loans, actually sat at my new desk, and cried while clicking the button to transfer $87,000, watching that balance I'd been carrying like a weight around my neck for 7 years finally hit zero. I was working part-time now at the design firm, 25 hours a week, and I'd enrolled in ceramics classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the Community Arts Center, something I'd wanted to do since college but could never afford. And therapy with Dr. Mitchell every Wednesday morning had become the anchor of my week, the place where I was slowly unpacking 25 years of emotional abuse that had been disguised as character building, where I was learning that my worth wasn't contingent on my parents' approval or anyone else's. Grandpa visited every Sunday, a standing brunch date we'd established 6 weeks after that birthday dinner, and we were building something real, a relationship based on genuine care rather than obligation. And he told me stories about my grandmother, about how fierce she'd been about family, and how she would have been horrified to know what my parents had done. Marcus had reached out 5 weeks after the confrontation, a text that said simply, "Can we talk? I need to understand what happened." And we'd met for coffee at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between his place and mine. And he'd looked tired, older somehow, and he'd said, "I've been thinking about everything, about how they treated you versus how they treated me. And I started therapy last week because I'm realizing I don't know who I am without their money and their approval." And I'd felt something unlock in my chest because he was my brother. He'd been a child too. None of this had been his fault, even though he'd benefited from it. My parents had sent a letter through their attorney 6 weeks into my no-contact boundary, a formal letter demanding a family meeting to resolve this misunderstanding, and I'd responded through the attorney Grandpa had connected me with, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in family law, and my response had been simple. I wasn't ready, might never be ready, and that was okay. I was learning that I didn't owe them access to me just because we shared DNA. My 26th birthday fell on a Thursday, And I'd planned something I never would have imagined a year ago, a small celebration at my condo with the people who actually mattered. And when Grandpa arrived at 6:30, he was the first one there, carrying a wrapped package that looked old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, and he hugged me tight the way he did now at every greeting, making up for decades of distance that hadn't been his choice or mine, but my parents' careful orchestration of family dynamics. Marcus came next with his girlfriend Sophie, not his ex-fiancée, because that engagement had ended 4 months ago when he'd realized he'd proposed because our parents expected it, and not because he actually wanted to marry her. And he was still in therapy twice a week, still unpacking what it meant to build an identity separate from our parents' money and expectations. And he handed me a gift bag with a smile that looked genuinely proud and said, "I bought this myself, with money I earned, and I actually put thought into what you'd like instead of just buying something expensive." And inside was a beautiful leather-bound sketchbook and a set of professional colored pencils, because he'd been paying attention when I mentioned wanting to do more hand sketching for my design work. My friend Allison came with her husband, and my friend Dev from the ceramics class, and my coworker Janet, who'd become a real friend over the past year when I'd finally had the emotional space to let people in, and we ate Thai food I'd ordered from the good place I could afford now, and drank wine that cost more than $12 a bottle, and it felt warm and real, and nothing like those formal dinners at my parents' house where every conversation had been a performance. The card had arrived 3 days ago, forwarded from my old apartment to my new address somehow, my mother's handwriting on the expensive cream envelope, and it was sitting in my desk drawer unopened because Dr. Mitchell and I had talked about it and decided I'd open it when and if I felt ready, that I didn't owe them my attention just because they'd decided to reach out, that my boundaries were mine to maintain. After dinner, after the cake that Grandpa had insisted on bringing from the French bakery my grandmother used to love, he handed me the wrapped package, and his hands were shaking slightly, and he said, "This was your grandmother's. She left instructions that you were to have it on your 26th birthday if anything happened to her. But she died when you were 2, and in my grief I forgot. And I only found it last month when I was going through storage." I unwrapped it carefully, the old paper tearing along creases that had been folded for 24 years, and inside was a silver frame, tarnished slightly with age, and in it was a photograph of a woman I barely remembered holding a baby who was clearly me, and I was maybe 6 months old in the photo, and my grandmother was looking down at me with such pure love on her face that I felt my throat tighten. And when I turned the frame over, there was a note taped to the back in handwriting I didn't recognize, but knew must be hers, and it said, "For Emily's future, with all our love, may she always know her worth and never let anyone diminish her light." Grandpa's voice was rough when he said, "The trust fund was her idea. She insisted on it. She saw how your father was even then, how he needed to control everything, and she wanted to make sure you'd be secure, that you'd have choices." And I was crying now, couldn't help it, and I said, "I wish I'd known her." And Grandpa said, "She knew you, and she loved you, and Emily, she would be so proud of who you've become, not because of the money or what you've done with it, but because of your resilience, your boundaries, the choices you've made to build a life of authenticity instead of obligation." Marcus was quiet beside me, and I saw him wipe his eyes, and I realized this was the first time he'd heard any of this too. The first time he'd understood that our grandmother had seen what our parents were and had tried to protect us, and later, after everyone had left and it was just Grandpa and me cleaning up, he told me that our grandmother had wanted a trust for Marcus too, but our father had refused, had said his son wouldn't need it because he'd teach him to be a man, to earn his own way, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on either of us that I'd been the one forced to earn my own way, while Marcus had been handed everything. Dr. Mitchell had suggested the letter exercise 6 weeks ago, saying it might help me process everything that had happened, and I'd resisted at first because putting it all into words felt like making it too real. But last week I'd finally sat down at my desk with the leather-bound journal Marcus had given me, and I'd written it, a letter to myself that started with, "Dear Emily at 25," and ended with, Love Emily at 26, and reading it back now, 2 days after my birthday celebration, I could see how far I'd traveled in a single year, how much had changed not just in my circumstances, but in my understanding of who I was and what I deserved. The letter acknowledged the pain of my parents' betrayal, named it clearly without softening it, but it also refused to let that betrayal define me, refused to give them that power over my narrative. And I'd written that my parents might never understand what they'd done, might never be capable of the kind of genuine accountability that would make a relationship possible, and that was their loss, not mine. Their choice to prioritize control over connection, their decision to value some twisted lesson about character over their daughter's well-being. I was building a life of authenticity now, surrounding myself with people who celebrated rather than diminished me. And the trust fund had changed my circumstances, had removed the financial pressure that had been crushing me for 7 years. But I had changed myself through therapy, through boundary setting, through the hard work of learning that my worth wasn't contingent on anyone's approval or validation. Money had been the catalyst, but not the solution. And sometimes late at night, I wondered if I would have found myself without this crisis, without the dramatic revelation that had shattered my understanding of my family. And I'd decided that yes, I would have eventually, but this had accelerated it, had forced me to confront truths I might have spent decades dancing around, had given me the resources to build the life I wanted instead of the life I could barely afford. Grandpa had called me yesterday morning and asked if I wanted to visit grandmother's grave. Said he'd been meaning to take me for months, but wanted to wait until I was ready. And I'd said yes immediately, because I was ready. I wanted to thank her. Wanted to stand at the place where she rested and acknowledge what she'd given me. And so this morning, I found myself standing in Mount Hope Cemetery, on a hill overlooking the city, and Grandpa had shown me the simple granite headstone that read, Margaret Ann Foster, beloved wife and grandmother. And I'd knelt and placed the bouquet of white roses I'd brought, and I'd said out loud, "Thank you, Grandma. Not just for the money, but for seeing me, for knowing I'd need choices, for giving me a chance at a different life." And the wind moved through the oak trees surrounding us, and I felt something settle in my chest, something that felt like peace, or maybe permission. And when I stood up, Grandpa was wiping his eyes, and he squeezed my shoulder and said, "She loved you so much, Emily. She would be so proud." And we walked back down the hill together toward where he'd parked his car, and the sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. And I looked back once at the grave, and then forward toward the future, my future, the one I was building with intention and boundaries, and the knowledge that I was enough. I had always been enough, and I was finally ready for whatever came next.